crowd had already gathered long before the sun rose over the city walls. Word had spread through the narrow streets the night before. A sentence had been passed, a life would end, and somewhere in the shadows of the town square, one man was already awake, preparing the tools that would decide another person's final moments. He sharpened steel in silence, knowing that in a few hours thousands of eyes would be watching him. But while the condemned prisoner feared death, the man holding the blade feared something else entirely. Because in medieval Europe, the executioner was both feared and despised, yet absolutely necessary. He carried out justice for kings, bishops, and courts, but society treated him like a cursed outcast, and behind the spectacle of public punishment was a secret world of brutal training, strange privileges, hidden wealth, and lifelong isolation that most people never saw. At first glance, medieval justice seemed simple. Crime was punished publicly, quickly, and often brutally. Town squares became stages where power was displayed and order was restored. But the reality behind these punishments was far more complicated, because every execution required someone willing to perform the act itself. Someone had to hold the sword. Someone had to tighten the noose. Someone had to raise the axe. That someone was the executioner. Yet the strange truth was that the man responsible for carrying out justice lived a life closer to a criminal than a respected official. He worked for the authorities, but ordinary citizens avoided him as if he carried a disease. His children struggled to marry. His family lived on the edge of society. Even touching him was believed by some to bring bad luck. Still, when the time came to carry out the law, everyone depended on him. To understand why executioners lived such unusual lives, we must travel back to the turbulent world of medieval Europe. It was a time when kingdoms were fragile, rulers struggled to maintain control, and justice was often harsh. Cities were surrounded by stone walls, their streets narrow and crowded. Markets filled the air with the smells of bread, animals, and smoke from blacksmith fires. Bells rang from towering churches that dominated the skyline. Life in these towns was governed by strict laws and powerful authorities. The church held enormous influence over daily life. Kings and nobles controlled land and armies, and local courts enforced rules meant to maintain order in a society where crime, poverty, and violence were common. Punishments in this world were rarely private. Instead, they were designed to be seen. Public justice served a purpose. Authorities believed that visible punishment would frighten others into obedience. If people witnessed the consequences of theft, murder, or rebellion, they might think twice before committing similar acts. So criminals were displayed in public cages, whipped in crowded streets, or executed in large gatherings where entire communities watched. But this system created a strange dilemma, because someone had to perform the punishment. At first, this role was not always assigned to a specific individual. In some early medieval communities, soldiers or officials might carry out executions. But over time, authorities realized something important. Executing people required skill. A poorly performed execution could turn into chaos. If a sword strike failed to kill instantly, the crowd might become angry or horrified. If a hanging rope broke, it could appear as though divine forces had intervened. If torture was carried out clumsily during interrogations, confessions might not be considered valid. In a society deeply influenced by religion and superstition, such mistakes could be interpreted as signs of injustice. Everything was about to change. Gradually, cities began appointing professional executioners whose job was to carry out punishments properly and efficiently. These men became official servants of the courts. They received payment, housing, and sometimes special privileges. But their role came with a terrible price. The moment a man became an executioner, his life changed forever. Many people believed executioners were spiritually contaminated by the blood they spilled. Killing, even when ordered by the law, was seen as morally dangerous. Some believed that those who carried out executions had become permanently stained by death. As a result, society pushed them to the margins. Executioners and their families often lived outside city walls or in isolated houses on the outskirts of town. When they entered markets or public areas, people avoided them. Some merchants refused to sell goods directly to them, forcing them to leave money on tables and collect items after the seller stepped away. Children of executioners faced similar discrimination. Few families wanted their sons or daughters to marry into what many considered a cursed profession. Over time, this created an unusual pattern. Executioners often married within their own small social circle, sometimes the children of other executioners, gravediggers, or individuals already considered outsiders. In some regions, entire family dynasties of executioners formed. One of the most famous examples appeared in Germany during the early modern period, where families like the Sansons and others served as executioners for generations. Sons were trained by fathers, learning the precise techniques required to perform their grim duties. Because this job demanded far more skill than most people realized. For example, executing someone with a sword required incredible precision. A skilled executioner aimed to end a life with a single clean strike. If the blow failed, the result could be horrifying. Historical records describe cases where executioners needed multiple attempts to complete the task, turning an already brutal event into a terrifying spectacle. Crowds did not always respond kindly to such failures. Angry spectators sometimes threw stones or insults at executioners who botched executions. In extreme cases, mobs attacked them. The irony was clear. Society demanded executions but despised the man responsible for performing them. And yet executioners possessed a unique form of power, because their position placed them in close contact with the darkest corners of medieval society. They handled criminals, corpses, torture chambers, and punishments that few others dared to approach. This gave them unusual knowledge about medicine, anatomy, and the human body. In fact, some executioners became surprisingly skilled healers, because they had access to human bodies and experience with wounds, bones, and injuries. Executioners sometimes developed medical expertise that ordinary physicians lacked. In certain regions, people secretly visited them for treatments ranging from bone setting to herbal remedies. This created another strange contradiction. The same people who avoided executioners in public might quietly seek their help when injured or ill. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the executioner's world was the work that happened before the execution itself. Because in many medieval legal systems, extracting a confession was considered essential for proving guilt, and this often involved torture. Inside dimly lit chambers beneath castles or city halls, prisoners were subjected to brutal methods designed to force them to confess crimes. The executioner frequently served as the official torturer, operating devices such as the rack, thumbscrews, or other painful instruments. These interrogations could last hours or even days. Yet even here, strange rules existed. Many legal systems required that torture follow strict procedures. The executioner had to ensure the prisoner remained alive and capable of confessing. If the victim died during interrogation, the authorities could face legal problems. So the executioner needed careful control over the pain he inflicted. It was a grim science of suffering. But there was something else about executioners that fascinated medieval society. They often possessed privileges that ordinary citizens did not. Some executioners were allowed to collect discarded clothing from executed criminals. Others could claim certain items from the marketplace without paying full price. In some cities, they received tax exemptions or special wages from the local government. These privileges existed because authorities knew how difficult it was to find someone willing to take the job. And once a man accepted the role, leaving it was nearly impossible, because no other profession wanted him. Everything about the executioner's life revolved around death, and yet the most terrifying moments still occurred on the day of an execution. The entire town would gather in the square. Children climbed onto rooftops for a better view. Merchants paused their work. Priests prepared final prayers. Soldiers escorted the condemned prisoner toward the platform where the executioner waited. The atmosphere was tense, almost theatrical. Some spectators watched with grim curiosity. Others treated the event like entertainment. Vendors sometimes sold food and drinks during large executions, but for the executioner, every moment mattered. He inspected his blade, measured his stance, studied the prisoner. One mistake could destroy his reputation, or worse, because in that moment thousands of eyes were watching. And justice, as the medieval world understood it, depended on his hands. But what happened behind the scenes of these executions, the secrets of how executioners trained, the hidden lives they led, and the terrifying punishments they carried out would reveal a world far darker than most people imagined. The morning of an execution often began long before the crowds arrived. In a quiet corner of the city, far from the noise of markets and church bells, the executioner prepared in silence. His tools were laid out carefully on a wooden table, an axe polished to a sharp edge, ropes coiled neatly, iron shackles, and sometimes instruments that had already caused unimaginable pain in the dark chambers of the city's prison. Every piece of equipment had to be inspected with precision, because if something failed in front of the public, the consequences could be disastrous. For the executioner, this moment was not just another task. It was a performance of authority, watched by the entire community. And despite the hatred many citizens felt toward him, they demanded perfection. A single clean stroke of the blade was considered a sign of skill and mercy. A mistake, however, could turn the executioner into the target of public rage. But long before a man ever stood on the scaffold with a weapon in his hands, he had already spent years learning how to perform one of the most feared professions in medieval Europe. Training to become an executioner was rarely a matter of choice. Most executioners were born into the profession. Their fathers held the same position, and from childhood they were expected to inherit the role. Growing up in such families meant living with constant social isolation. Other children avoided them. Parents warned their sons and daughters to stay away, and teachers sometimes treated them with suspicion. But inside the executioner's household, a different kind of education took place. Young boys learned how to sharpen blades properly, how to handle heavy axes, and how to maintain the tools used for torture and punishment. They studied anatomy, not through books like university physicians, but through direct experience. Their fathers explained where bones lay beneath the skin, where arteries carried blood, and how a single precise movement could end a life quickly. This knowledge was not taught in public schools. It was passed down quietly from one generation to the next. Some executioner families even kept handwritten journals recording techniques and experiences. These rare documents described the best ways to perform certain punishments and how to avoid mistakes that could cause unnecessary suffering or anger the crowd. Because although medieval justice was brutal, it also followed strict rituals. Everything about an execution had to appear orderly and legitimate. The prisoner was usually escorted to the site by guards while priests offered final prayers. Officials read the sentence aloud so everyone present understood the authority behind the punishment. Then the executioner stepped forward. For the condemned person, this was the final face they would see. Yet even here, strange traditions sometimes existed. In certain regions, the executioner would ask the prisoner for forgiveness before carrying out the sentence. This ritual was meant to separate the man performing the act from the responsibility for the crime itself. The executioner was merely the instrument of the law, not its author, but that distinction rarely changed how society viewed him. Despite performing a role essential to maintaining order, executioners remained outsiders. Many cities forced them to live in specific districts or houses located near cemeteries, prisons, or city gates. These areas were often avoided by ordinary residents. Visitors might notice how the executioner's home stood alone at the edge of town, separated from the bustling life within the walls. Yet within that isolation, the executioner's family created its own strange community. Because over time, marriages between executioner families became common. A daughter of one executioner might marry the son of another from a neighboring city. This created networks of families across Europe who shared the same profession and social status. Some of these families became famous. In parts of Germany and France, records show executioner dynasties lasting for centuries. Fathers trained sons, who later trained their own children, creating a lineage of men who carried out justice generation after generation. But being an executioner involved far more than simply performing executions. Their responsibilities extended into many unpleasant areas of medieval life. They were often responsible for removing animal carcasses from city streets, disposing of dead bodies that no one else wanted to handle, and maintaining gallows or punishment devices. In some towns, they supervised brothels or controlled the activities of individuals considered socially undesirable. This meant executioners constantly dealt with the darker side of society. They saw crimes, disease, poverty, and violence up close. They witnessed the final moments of criminals, rebels, and sometimes innocent people caught in political struggles. And those political struggles could make their work far more dangerous, because not every execution involved an ordinary criminal. Sometimes the condemned person was a noble, a knight, or even a political rival of powerful leaders. In these cases, the entire atmosphere of the execution changed. Crowds gathered in greater numbers, rumors spread through the city, and the tension in the air became almost unbearable. Executing a nobleman required extraordinary care. If the executioner failed to perform the act cleanly, it could be seen as dishonoring the prisoner's rank. Historical records describe moments when executioners practiced repeatedly before carrying out such sentences. They sharpened their blades carefully and rehearsed their movements, knowing that one mistake could lead to disgrace, or worse. Because the crowd could turn violent. If spectators believed the executioner had caused unnecessary suffering, they sometimes attacked him. Stones could be thrown, insults shouted. In extreme cases, mobs attempted to rescue the condemned or punish the executioner themselves. Everything was about to change. One of the most infamous examples of a botched execution occurred in England in the early 18th century, when an executioner required multiple strikes to behead a condemned nobleman. The crowd reacted with fury. and the executioner narrowly escaped with his life. Such incidents reveal how fragile the executioner's position truly was. He was feared, despised, yet also expected to perform perfectly under enormous pressure. And sometimes the punishments themselves were so brutal that even hardened spectators struggled to watch. Medieval Europe developed a wide range of execution methods designed not only to kill but to send powerful messages. Hanging was common for thieves and common criminals. Beheading with a sword or axe was often reserved for nobles. Burning at the stake was used in cases involving heresy or witchcraft. But the most terrifying punishments were reserved for crimes considered especially dangerous to the state. Traitors could face methods designed to cause prolonged suffering. In some kingdoms, this involved being drawn through the streets, hanged, disemboweled, and finally beheaded. The executioner had to perform each step. It required strength, skill, and emotional detachment. Yet despite the brutality of these punishments, the executioner himself sometimes showed unexpected moments of mercy. Historical accounts describe executioners quietly adjusting ropes to shorten a prisoner's suffering during hangings. Others sharpened blades carefully to ensure a clean beheading. These small actions were rarely noticed by the crowds, but they reveal something deeply human about the men behind the profession. They lived daily with death, and many of them understood the terror of the people they executed. But there was one aspect of the executioner's life that remained especially mysterious. Because while society treated them as untouchable outsiders, some executioners quietly accumulated wealth. Their official salaries were often modest, but their unusual privileges created opportunities to earn more money. They received payments for performing interrogations, maintaining punishment equipment, and carrying out executions. They also claimed clothing, jewelry, and belongings taken from executed criminals. Over time, these items could become surprisingly valuable. Some executioners even invested their earnings in property or businesses operated through relatives who were not directly associated with the profession. So behind the image of the grim executioner standing on a scaffold, there sometimes existed a man whose private life was far more complicated. But even wealth could not erase the social barriers surrounding him. Because in medieval society, reputation meant everything. And once a man became an executioner, that reputation followed him and his children for the rest of their lives. Yet the most dramatic moments in the executioner's world were still to come, because across medieval Europe there were executions so shocking, so politically charged, and so brutal that they changed the way people viewed justice forever. And when those moments arrived, the executioner stood at the center of history, holding the weapon that would decide the fate of kings, rebels, and empires. Sometimes the most dangerous executions were not those involving criminals, but those involving power. When the condemned prisoner was a noble, a military leader, or someone connected to a political struggle, the entire atmosphere surrounding the execution changed. The town square would fill earlier than usual. Soldiers stood in tighter formations. Officials whispered to one another as tension spread through the crowd like a storm waiting to break. Because when power was involved, an execution was no longer just punishment. It was a message. And the executioner, standing quietly beside the scaffold with his tools, understood that better than anyone. By the late Middle Ages, Europe had become a continent of kingdoms constantly struggling for control. Wars erupted between rival dynasties. Noble families fought for land and influence. Kings feared rebellion from powerful lords who commanded private armies. In this dangerous political world, executions served another purpose. They demonstrated authority. When a ruler ordered the death of a rival, the public spectacle of execution became proof that power still rested in the hands of the crown. Crowds gathered not only to witness justice, but to see who held control. Yet for the executioner, these moments carried enormous risk. Because executing a noble was very different from executing a thief. The condemned person might have loyal supporters within the crowd. Rumors could spread quickly that the trial had been unfair or politically motivated. If the execution appeared cruel or clumsy, it could ignite outrage among people already suspicious of the authorities. The executioner had to be perfect. He studied the prisoner carefully, measured the distance of the strike, and held the weapon steady. A single clean movement was essential, not only to end the prisoner's life quickly, but to protect himself from the fury of thousands watching. But even when the execution was carried out flawlessly, the crowd's reaction could be unpredictable. Some spectators cheered when criminals were punished. Others watched in silence, disturbed by the violence unfolding before them. A few turned away, unable to witness the moment when steel met flesh. and sometimes the crowd sympathized with the condemned. In such moments, the executioner could feel the weight of thousands of eyes upon him. Because despite all the rituals and legal procedures surrounding an execution, everyone present understood the truth. This man was about to kill another human being, and no ceremony could hide that reality. Yet the executioner rarely spoke. His role required silence. He stood beside the scaffold like a shadow of the law itself, carrying out the sentence without emotion. But inside, the experience could leave deep marks. Some executioners witnessed hundreds of deaths during their careers. Others carried out torture sessions that lasted hours, hearing screams echo through cold stone chambers beneath castles and city halls. Over time, such experiences shaped the way they viewed the world. Many became emotionally distant, focusing only on the technical aspects of their work. Others turned to alcohol or isolation to cope with the psychological burden of their profession, because the truth was something medieval society rarely acknowledged. Executioners were human, and performing such acts repeatedly could leave scars that no one else saw. Yet even as the executioner's personal world grew darker, the system of punishment across Europe continued evolving. By the 15th and 16th centuries, cities had developed elaborate legal systems governing crime and punishment. Courts recorded trials in written documents. Judges followed increasingly complex procedures, and executioners became official employees of municipal governments. Their work was now part of a structured system of justice, but that system still included horrifying punishments designed to terrify the population. One particularly infamous method was breaking on the wheel. This punishment involved tying the condemned prisoner to a large wooden wheel, while the executioner shattered their bones with an iron bar. The victim was sometimes left displayed on the wheel for hours or even days before death finally arrived. The purpose was not simply to kill. It was to create a spectacle of suffering that warned others what awaited those who defied authority. And once again, the executioner stood at the center of the event. Another punishment used in parts of Europe was burning at the stake. This method was most commonly associated with accusations of heresy or witchcraft during periods of intense religious conflict. When individuals were condemned for such crimes, large crowds gathered to witness the burning. Religious officials prayed as flames rose into the sky. The executioner supervised the fire, ensuring the sentence was carried out exactly as ordered. These events were deeply emotional moments for medieval communities. Some people believed they were witnessing the destruction of evil. Others felt uneasy watching a human being die in such agony, but no one felt the weight of the moment more than the executioner himself, because he was the one who made it happen. Yet despite the brutality of his duties, the executioner sometimes held a strange position of authority within society's hidden corners. Criminals feared him. Prisoners whispered about him in dark cells before interrogations. Rumors spread that he could break even the strongest men through torture. His reputation alone could influence whether a suspect confessed to a crime. And because he handled bodies and injuries regularly, his knowledge of anatomy became unusually advanced for the time. In fact, some executioners gained reputations as skilled healers. People suffering from broken bones or dislocated joints occasionally sought out executioners for treatment. Physicians trained at universities often studied ancient texts but lacked practical experience with injuries. Executioners, on the other hand, understood the human body through direct observation. They knew where bones could break and how they could be set again. This strange contradiction created one of the most unusual roles in medieval society. The same man who ended lives could sometimes help save them, but none of these contradictions erased the social stigma surrounding the profession. Executioners remained outsiders. Their homes were avoided. Their children struggled to marry outside the small circle of families connected to similar professions, and yet the towns and cities that rejected them could not function without them. Justice demanded their presence, because in the medieval world, laws were not merely written in books. They were enforced in public squares, before the eyes of entire communities. And at the center of that system stood the executioner, a man feared by criminals, avoided by citizens, employed by rulers, and forever trapped in a profession that defined his life from the moment he first raised the blade. But the most dramatic transformation of this grim profession was still approaching, because as Europe moved toward the modern age, attitudes toward justice, punishment, and public executions would begin to change. And when those changes arrived, the executioner's world, along with the brutal spectacles that defined it, would slowly start to disappear. Yet the legacy of these men would remain. leaving behind one of the most disturbing chapters in the history of European justice. Their stories remind us that behind every system of law stands someone tasked with enforcing it, and sometimes that responsibility carries a burden heavier than the blade itself.